Thanks very much, Celia, and thanks, comrades, for coming. I've got the slightly unenviable task of launching a new book, of which we have no copies here. I'd like to apportion blame, but it's no one in this room's fault. So I'm going to talk about the topic of the book, why it was written, and what I hope to achieve with it, and hopefully it will inspire you enough that you go off and buy it online as soon as you leave the room, or perhaps on your phones during the event. The book is called Socialism or Extinction, and it was written, or came to fruition if you like, in the immediate aftermath of the COP26 talks that took place in Glasgow last year. In many senses, it was a personal rage of anger at another conference, another opportunity squandered to make a real difference to the environmental issues that are threatening the lives of literally millions of people. Climate change is taking place now on a scale that is actually quite difficult to comprehend. The UN itself says that there are 3.6 billion people living currently on the world in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change, their words. That's half the world's population, and we know the reality is that the vast majority of those people will be poor. Almost all of them will live in the global south, though they won't just live in the global south. You look at Hurricane Ian that has devastated parts of the Caribbean and Florida in the last couple of weeks, you'll notice that the news reports have emphasised repeatedly that the people who were impacted the worst are the poorest people, people who live in temporary housing, people who have no access to jobs or money or so on. And one of the themes of the book was the way that climate change is a disproportionate impactor. It hits the poor, it hits black communities, it hits women more than it hits wealthy white communities. And even in the rich nations, countries like the United States, it will be poor communities that suffer first and worst from a warming world. As I said, climate change is taking place on an unprecedented scale. It's easy to detect sometimes in reporting of climate change, however, the way that the divisions in society, old antagonisms, old differences, make themselves felt through how news of environmental disaster is reported. So there's been lots of coverage of the impact of Hurricane Ian on Florida. There's been slightly less coverage of the impact of Hurricane Ian on the other Caribbean islands, Cuba in particular. At the same time, there was almost zero coverage. In fact, you would have to work very, very hard to see, the same week that Hurricane Ian hit the Caribbean, that the UN reported that in the Greater Horn of Africa, the rains have failed for the 5th year running, which means that around 50 million people are now living in what they call acute food stress as a result of climate change. You can see how the talking about climate change, the analysis, the discussion is skewed by the media, skewed by political realities, skewed by the legacies of colonialism and imperialism to focus on wealthier, richer nations, and implicit in that, often nations where people are predominantly white. And so one of the things I wanted to do with the book is to look at why this happens, to try and understand why it is that after decades of climate conferences, after decades of scientific warnings, after decades of analysis that says we are heading to the disaster, why nothing is happening, why there's almost like a self-imposed limit, if you like, on the system to any ability to deal and to change things and to make things better. I say decades, it's worth remembering in the book, I quote an American physicist who did a talk at a conference of the petrochemical industry in the United States in 1959, where he talks about the reality and the potential of climate change from countries to melt, to flood cities like New York, and he's quizzed by representatives of different oil companies about how quickly it can happen, is he exaggerating and so on. So this is a real issue. This is an issue that has been there for a lot longer than many of us even comprehend. But certainly the last 26, 27 years, those years of those COP conferences, are the years of inaction, the years of failure. And so the book analyses some of what causes this inertia, if you like, this failure to act, this almost deliberate failure to do anything impossible. Part of that's about politicians, isn't it? Part of it's about people's personal political interests. Liz Truss, for instance, who went through the graduate programme from the University of Oxford straight into working for Shell, and as far as I can see, is continuing to work in Parliament, and in number 10, a woman who's alongside Jacob Rees-Mogg have decided that the very most important thing for them to do once elected was to restart fracking, to end the moratorium, and so on. And so partly you see an overlap between the interests of the oil companies, big fossil fuel corporations at the heart of the system, and the interests of the political class and the politicians and so on. But that's not enough. It's not enough simply to blame the individuals. We should do that. We should point the finger of blame. We should point the finger of hypocrisy at these people. But we also have to understand what it is about the system itself. And I tell the story in the book about how the development of capitalism sees the coming together, the wedding together of the fossil fuel capitalist system, the fossil fuel industry, tightly together with the interests of capitalism as a whole. You see it as a minimum imagination. You see a shift from water power for the cotton industry to coal, and eventually oil and gas and other forms of fossil fuels. A shift that was deliberately made by the capitalists so they could maximise their profits. And over the 100, 200, 250 years since then, what we've seen is that every part of the world, every part of the economy, that close link between fossil fuel corporations and the wider society, which is why it's so important that politicians do get bought off, if you like, by Shell or BP or all those other corporations. And we should be careful we don't fall into the trap of just seeing this as the result of the energy industry. Almost every aspect of our economy now is geared towards fossil fuels. The clothes that we wear, the food we eat, heavily dependent on plastics, on the burning of petrol or diesel, and so on. A system wedded to fossil fuels. But again, that's not enough. It's not enough just to point to the problems of oil and gas and coal and so on. We have to look a little bit deeper. And one of the great things about the Marxist tradition, I think, is the way it unpicks, if you like, the superficial aspects of society and looks deeper inside to say, what is it about the functioning of the system that brings all of these things together? The interests of the politicians and the capitalist class, and the interests of the fossil fuel corporations, all of those. And one of the things that Marx does, Capital in particular, is he shows how the relationship that capitalism has to the natural world, the relationship that is imposed upon us as society with capitalist development and the shattering of the old relations and the old social relations that took place with the rise of capitalism, is a transformation of our relationship to the natural world. That the natural world becomes something that's wedded to the capitalist industry in the interest of maximising profit. You know, things get turned into commodities, nature gets turned into something to be bought and sold or destroyed or used in the interest of making profit. And so one of the things I try and argue in the book is that the nature of capitalism itself is a system based on the competitive accumulation of wealth, different blocks of capital, different companies, multinationals, firms and so on, competing against each other in the interest of profit, drive this unprecedented desire for growth, this unprecedented desire for profit, which you see writ large on the media today, don't you, with Liz Truss talking about growth above everything else, and all of us apparently, anyone who's not Liz Truss and the core of the Tory party is part of this anti-growth coalition, apparently, which is allegedly there to stop them doing what they want and benefiting the economy. But of course the reality is capitalism itself is predicated on growth. Capitalism couldn't exist without this imperative to push outwards. And what that brings with it is a destruction of the natural world, an unprecedented, uncontrolled, irrational usage of nature in the interest of maximising profit, which in the context of climate change means the particularly untrammelled burning of fossil fuels and the desire to push outwards all the time, to burn more fossil fuels, even though it's so deeply illogical, deeply unscientific to continue doing that. They constantly are pushed to try and find more sources of oil, gas, shale gas and coal and the rest of it. And so the first half, almost to sort of crudely split the book that you can't see because it's not here, in half, is to say the first half is to explore and expand what that means, why capitalism destroys the environment at the same time as it exploits and oppresses people, and what that means for people around the world, what it means in terms of infrastructure, what it means in terms of agriculture and farming, what it means in terms of the threat to people's lives. And the second part of the book is the bit that says actually we need a revolution to deal with this. And I think one of the interesting things about the development of the environmental movement over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, is the way that the sense of the need for urgent fundamental change has become really dominant inside the movement. You see it everywhere. Every time you go on a demonstration, there's always placards somewhere that say system change, not climate change. A sense, an almost instinctive sense from ordinary people, that there needs to be some form of fundamental change, that you can't simply tinker with the system. And part of the reason for that is people know that you can't tinker with the system because they see that for 26 years at those conferences, and no doubt in Egypt at COP27 in December, they'll try it again. They're trying to tinker with the system, to find little fundamental changes, little minor market mechanisms or carbon trading schemes or technological solutions that can alter the balance and make things a little bit better. And people say that's not, clearly it's not enough. Clearly it's not enough. We've got half we need something more fundamental than this. We've got these oil corporations that are still churning their millions, and surely we need to do something a bit more fundamental on that. So system change becomes a sort of de facto demand. But what I think you have to say as socialist is actually it's not enough to be, you have to be explicit by what you mean by system change. And too much, I think, of what you might loosely and fraternally call left ecological environmental writing, I think really ultimately boils down to saying let's have a radical critique of capitalism, but actually we haven't got enough fundamental alternatives. So really what we end up saying is that we're going to green capitalism, we'll make capitalism a little bit better, we'll challenge the fossil fuel corporations, we'll insulate all the homes, we'll create some jobs, we'll nationalise public transport, all of these things which we urgently need and should happen, but won't be enough in and of themselves. And in a sense, the book is in part a polemic, though perhaps it's more nicer to say it's a debate, with many of those on the left who are engaging in that debate, in those serious discussions about what system change means, and to actually say that system change has to mean socialism, it has to mean the transformation and the ending of the old order, the ending of capitalism, the building of a socialist society based on a completely different relationship with the natural world, completely different relationship between human beings, and a completely different relationship to everything else. The ending of private property, the ending of the farcical reality where a tiny minority of people at the top of society own and control all the wealth, all the means of production, while the rest of us have to labour on the land or in the factories or in the call centres to help them maximise their profits. And so what I do in the book is I tell the story of what revolution means. And partly it's important because I don't think necessarily revolution means the same today as it did 100 years ago or 150 years ago. The nature of the working class, the nature of social movements has changed over time. But I do think the lessons of history matter, and in the book I talk a little bit about some of the great revolutions of history, in particular the Paris Commune of 1871, when working people seized control of Paris for 3 months and held off the enemy forces for as long as they could. The Great Revolution of 1917 in Russia, when working people seized control, overthrowing the old Tsarist order and then overthrowing the new capitalist order that came and instituting the world's first workers' state. But I also talk about more recent revolutions, the revolution in Egypt in 2011, and look at the dynamic, the way working people and ordinary people in Cairo in particular, but in other working class cities of the Nile Delta take control and organise their communities and try to protect themselves and engage in incredibly intense debates about the future of the city, of the country, and how the revolution can move forward. And similarly, the story of the revolution, an ongoing heroic revolution in Sudan, which began in October 2019, which saw the destruction of a brutal military dictatorship, Omar al-Sharif, the overthrow of his regime, and the ongoing struggle that those workers are taking place. And the importance of that is manifold. Firstly, we learn from revolutions. Those first two, the Paris Commune and the Russian Revolution, were great teachers for the revolutionary left. Marx and Engels learned about the nature of the capitalist state from the Paris Commune. The idea that you can't seize control of the capitalist state for the working class. It has to be, you have to create a new state that can be run in the interest of the masses, not the minority. The Russian revolutionary similarly teaching a new generation of revolutionaries about the nature of capitalism and the type of revolutionary movements you need and so on. And I think we also learn from Sudan and Egypt, again, about the versatility and the power and the strength of organised working people, their ability to run society anew, to see the world through a different way when they've gone through a revolutionary process, to understand that things can be done can be done differently. So in part the book is to rescue that tradition of revolution, to say revolution isn't that bloody, violent minority sport that the Tories would like you to believe. It's a mass rebellion of ordinary people to try and change the world. But also it has to be something that we understand politically. And in part, some of the book is a dialogue with those who don't understand the real nature of the capitalist state. The state that is there to protect the interests of the working class, to protect the interests of the bosses and big business, to protect the interests of the profiteers, and needs to be challenged. And so I use those lessons of history to say, what does that mean for today? And what does it mean for 21st century capitalism with a capitalist state that's immensely powerful, that's got so much military power and weaponry and state and the courts and the judicial system and so on. And how do we as a movement break out of some of those traps? How do we deal with the violence of the state? And what does a worker state mean in counterparts to capitalism? Finally, however, I take up the argument about the urgency for this and what you do as activists in the here and now, because there's a tendency, and it's understandable in a sense, for people to say, look, the scale of the problem is so bad that the most important thing we can do now is to try and make things a little bit better as quickly as we can. And I argue that that isn't a solution, because I think what that ends up doing is to say we have to end up begging for a few crumbs from the government, a few crumbs from the politicians at the top. And as we've seen, they won't do anything. They won't give an inch. They'll tell us they're going to do something, but actually they'll do very, very little to make things better. And they certainly aren't going to help those people around the world who need the help and the urgency. If they were going to do that, they'd have given the money at COP26 that have been demanded for years and years to help mitigate the impact of climate change on the global south. Instead, I argue that what we have to do as a movement is to find ways of developing the combativity and the strength of the social movement to take on capitalism in the here and now. And that means fighting for demand, real demands now. It means fighting, for instance, against fracking, against the ending of the moratorium, and saying that actually what we need to do is to engage and involve the most number of people, the widest social forces, and in particular the organised working class, in the movement to say not just that we're against fracking, but we're for these alternatives, for renewable energies, for public transport and so on, that will bring real jobs and real improvements at the same time as ending the destruction of the planet. And winning those games can give combativity and confidence to a new generation of people. And I emphasise the importance in this of the working class. And you see, I think this is one thing that the socialist movement can bring to the wider environmental movement, is a sense of actually there is a power in society that can change the world. There's a power in society that creates all the wealth for the bosses, that keeps the wheels of business turning, that drives the trams and the trains, that keeps the offices working, that keeps the libraries functioning and the schools and the hospitals going. And those are organised working people, and they have the power not just to stop capitalism, but to build a society anew. And I celebrate through the book the sense of ordinary working people not just overthrowing old orders and fighting back against the system and ending the capitalist rule, but actually creating things new. That revolution is a process that is both creative as well as destructive. Destructive of the old order, destructive of the capitalist system, but creative in the sense of a revolution from below, creating institutions and organisations that can form the basis for a new democratic planning of the economy in the interest of everyone. And I think that's a vision that I think is very important to hold on to. A sense that actually the future isn't going to be a greener capitalism where we're all slightly less exploited and the world is a little bit better. The future has to be one where ordinary people are in the saddle. Ordinary people run and organise society in their interest of themselves, the future generations, and their and the planet itself. The Hungarian Marxist George Lukács wrote famously about a phrase called the actuality of revolution. And sometimes this is misinterpreted to think people meant that what Lukács meant was that revolution is an actuality if you go out and make a revolution. That revolutions have to make it, create it out of their heads, force it to happen. What actually Lukács was saying is that the contradictions of capitalism, The contradictions of system that breeds competition at every level leads to war between nations, it leads to competition between individuals and businesses, and so on. It leads to economic crisis, environmental destruction, conflict, racism, oppression, and so on. What Lukács actually meant is the actuality of revolution arises out of those contradictions of capitalism. That actually capitalism creates the potential for revolution at various points in history, and that the job of revolutionaries is not to try and dynamite it by throwing a bomb or writing the right slogan on the wall. That the job of revolutionaries at every stage is to increase the confidence and the combativity of the force in society that can change the world, and that's the working class. And for environmentalists, I think this is inspiring. This is a different vision, because it's about saying there is a force in society that can overthrow capitalism, and we don't have to just hope that things will be a little bit better in the future. But I also think we have to, and I will finish at this last point, Chair, we have to be brutally honest. If there isn't that sort of radical transformation in the next decade or thereabouts, in large parts of the world, actually the future is very, very bleak. The phrase socialism or extinction is not rhetoric, I think it's the reality, because actually the nature of capitalism in the 21st century is ecological disaster combined with war, combined with the potential for nuclear destruction. And actually the fight of our lives now, and the fight for future generations, is a fight for a different way of organising society, because if we don't win that, then actually the future is bleak. But actually if we do win it, then the potential for a new way of organising society in all our interests and for future generations is there for the winning. As Karl Marx said, workers of the world unite, you have a world to win. Today that's very, very real. Thank you.